This video will be a continuation of our muscle tissue series, and in this video we are going to take a look at cardiac muscle. Before we do that, let's talk about the unifying characteristics of muscle tissue. All muscle tissue is excitable, or it exhibits excitability. This means that you can stimulate your muscle cells and they respond. Usually, they respond by sending an action potential through that muscle cell, which means our muscle cells are capable of conducting electrical signals, so they exhibit conductibility. When that action potential moves through the muscle cell, it will cause the muscle cell to contract, so all muscle cells exhibit contractility. This is going to make our muscle cells shorter. But not only can we make our muscle cells shorter, we can stretch them out in a characteristic that we called extensibility. And when we stretch our muscles, they are not stuck at that elongated length. They are going to return to their resting length in a characteristic we call elasticity. All muscle tissue is going to be very highly cellular, meaning when we look at that muscle tissue, all we're going to see are muscle cells, and we don't have any extracellular structures like we saw in connective tissue. And finally, all of our muscle tissues are highly vascular, meaning that they have very good blood supply. Now let's take a look at our cardiac muscle tissue, which we see here in our patchwork quilt picture. Again, when we look at cardiac muscle tissue, we're not going to see a lot of white space, and we're really looking at a whole lot of cells. Now this picture doesn't show it brilliantly, but our cardiac muscle tissue is striated. And we do have some pictures later on where you can clearly see the striations. Cardiac muscle cells are not nearly as long as skeletal muscle cells, and they tend to branch in different directions. Again, we can't see that very clearly on this picture, but many of our cardiac muscle cells do branch or fork. Cardiac muscle cells don't have quite as many nuclei, but you may see 1 to 6 nuclei per cell. Most of our cardiocytes are going to only have 1 nucleus per cell. Now the big important feature of cardiac muscle tissue that will help you seriously distinguish it from any other muscle are the intercalated discs. The intercalated discs are the connections between our cardiocytes. They're very sturdy connections so that our cardiocytes do not pull away from each other, and they contain gap junctions. We see these intercalated discs as the thicker purple lines crossing our cardiocytes. So if you see cardiac muscle in a microscope, I will always have the pointer pointing to an intercalated disc. Because we have these intercalated discs and these gap junctions, our cardiocytes are capable of passing action potentials from one cell to the next without stopping. This means that our cells do not have to be individually stimulated as we see with skeletal muscle, and indeed we don't even need the nervous system for our cardiac muscle to contract. So we have what's called automaticity, means that it can generate its own action potential without the nervous system. Once this signal is generated, our action potential travels all the way through our entire heart without stopping because of these gap junctions. So now we've got a great generalized description of our cardiac muscle cells. So where do we find cardiac muscle? Well, we find cardiac muscle in the walls of our heart. That is the only place we see cardiac muscle in our body. What are our functions of cardiac muscle? Cardiac muscle is going to contract, and when that occurs, it will propel blood through our great vessels, and then that passes on through our entire body. So fairly simple location, fairly simple function. Here we have our summary slide that shows us our intercalated discs and our functions and location of cardiac muscle. And we can take a look at different pictures. And in these different pictures, you may see some striations here in our cardiac muscle tissue. Striations aren't super prominent in cardiac muscle, but they are there. We can also see very clearly our intercalated discs running perpendicular to our cardiocytes. And one more picture where we can very clearly see our striations, and we can also very clearly see intercalated discs. So those intercalated discs, these are your giveaway to help you distinguish between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact your instructor.